Welcome back, Renee. Here we are, another episode. Tell me what we're doing today.
Well, we have one of my good friends, Nina, on today, and I'm super excited to talk with her. And she's had quite the story
Yeah,
dealing with her growing kids and all the
yeah.
different systems. So today we're going to talk about when mental health and juvenile justice and those systems collide. And if there's anybody that's walked both of those lines, it's Nina. So Nina,
Yeah.
we're excited you're here, kind of dive into your story. And you've been on the circuit telling a lot of people this story, and appreciate you taking time to be with us today. So thanks for being here, Nina. So Nina, part of the story we want to talk about today is how you got involved in behavioral health, and we'll get there. But before we start that, Jason, what is going on the farm in June?
I thought you were going to skip that part, Renee. You
Oh,
had
we
me
are gonna
confused
skip it.
there for a minute. I'm like, wow, I guess we're just starting the interview. It was a cold, cold spring this year, and now it's hot, hot, hot. And so I don't like the extremes. And it seems like as a farmer, we're up and down the extremes. And I always have to complain about something. So it's the weather.
What else would there be to complain about? So I know that the spring was wet, but you didn't get as much rain up there in Boone as we did in Des Moines, right? When we got that 4 to 6 inches overnight, you did not get that, right? That didn't happen.
No, but when it was super cold, it killed my basil plant in my backyard. So now I don't
Poor
have
basil
fresh
plant.
basil. I
Oh,
mean, so
it's the little things, I guess. That's really funny. Poor basil plant. Have to have a little ceremony for him. All right, well, let's get into the actual conversation today. So, Nina, you got into behavioral health, kind of an interesting direction. You came from a very different background. So, why don't you tell everybody who you are, kind of how you got to behavioral health in the first place, and sort of kick us off today?
Sure. So, Jason, I worked in agriculture for the first 15 years of my career, and I went to grad school at Iowa State. That's what brought me to Iowa, and I studied entomology and microbiology, worked in early stage product development at Pioneer and Corteva for a number of years. And then this thing happened in 2012, 2011, actually. I met these two little guys through the Iowa foster care system, and I became a foster parent. I took on two kids. They were ages 2 and 3 at the time. And the interesting thing about it, I didn't go into foster care necessarily being set on adopting them, but they never left. And so we've been together for 14 years now. And as I navigated the resources in Iowa for kids that have mental health issues and trauma histories and all of that, I became an advocate. And this was when I was working in agriculture. My personal life was deeply immersed in trying to get services and supports for my family. And at a certain point, I was doing this work and I was thinking, this is important work, working in agriculture and doing product development, but I don't feel like it's the thing that I can do for the world. I felt like I was okay at it, but it wasn't my true thing for what I could give the world. So I started to think about that and talk with other people that had made career transitions, and I was feeling a pull towards the policy space. And so I initially wanted to get into ag policy potentially. But what I learned about ag policy is that if you don't have a background in policy or government relations or some kind of related field, it's very hard to get hired in to do ag policy work. And my background was as a technical scientist. So trying to get people to take a chance on me as a policy person, it was a challenge because scientists are notoriously not the best communicators. So I had to make a couple side steps in my career. And so I moved over to the project and program management space in agriculture. And then I started volunteering at NAMI, Iowa. And I found that at NAMI, Iowa, you could actually be involved in the policy space as a volunteer. And so I started helping out with policy initiatives there and speaking at subcommittee meetings and sitting on committees and things. And so that was my first taste of what is the policy world like. And I felt like it was a good fit for me. It just took a couple side steps to get there. So I eventually made a transition over to a program management role at NAMI, Iowa. So that was my step into nonprofit world and also my step into the mental health world. And this feels like very important work to me. This feels like something that combining my personal experiences and just seeing the need and the gaps in the mental health space, it feels like the work that I'm supposed to be doing.
I was going to say, I think you and I met when you were first starting, when you were first coming over from agriculture into
Yep.
NAMI, because I was a legislator at the time, and you started coming to the Capitol for hearings or just with the team of people there at NAMI. And I don't even think you were working for them quite yet. You were
Nope.
just coming on as an advocate. And so you and I've known each other now for a long time. So I've gotten to hear your story about your boys growing up now over this period of time. And it's going to be quite a story. So Jason, do you remember how far back it was when you first met Nina? It's probably been with NAMI Iowa, maybe?
Yeah, it could have been at some of those meetings back in the day when you were a legislator, Renee. You know, there was a lot of us. I was in the child welfare space at the time. So similarly, I was working with programs that help support foster parents, and behavioral health programs for youth. So we were in a lot of the same space that overlapped. And I was very small, right? You run into people and you cross paths, and then, years later, you're like, oh, I remember we were sitting in that committee meeting together because these are shared issues, and I think we're all coming at them from a different direction. And so I'd love to hear, Nina, how did that intersect then with your personal life as things evolved and moved forward?
Yeah, well, navigating mental health systems has always been such a huge part of my day-to-day since I became a parent to my kids. So where it really, I think where it really came to a head, and so it's always impacted personal life, where it kind of intersected with my professional life was at the point where I could use my own story as and my own connections through the foster care circles and the, mental health services circles and all of that, to really help other families and also to build out programming that would benefit families like mine, kids like mine. So I think once you do work that intersects with both your personal experience and you get to do it professionally, it's nice because you're not thinking as two separate tracks. You're thinking like, okay, what would have helped me? What would help families that I know? And then it feels like big impact because you're really creating things that sort of serve the customer in a way. That's my science background and my innovation background is always trying to create what the customer needs. And so being able to bring that into the mental health space, it just was a very natural transition because I was always thinking of that through the customer. And then the customers become those that are impacted by mental illness, by, system dysfunction, all of that. So trying to think through what would help them.
So when you got your kids at 2 and 3, did you know there were going to be mental health challenges ahead? Did you understand from their backgrounds that that's the direction you were going to likely go, or is that something you sort of crashed into as you were caring for them?
Very much crashed into it. So when I completed my foster care classes, they had us fill out a sheet of paper and it said, what ages do you want to take? What level of need? So you could check mild, moderate, high needs. So I told what ages I was interested in. I said mild because I thought, well, this is my first time being a foster parent and I work full time, so I better check the mild box. Well, the reality is that none of that matters because they call you about everything. And they don't give a lot of information about what the needs are. And I think that's because a lot of times they don't know what the needs are. So you just say yes or no, and then they bring you some kids, and then you get to know the kids. And what I could base it off of was they had lived with another foster family before they lived with me. So the information from that family was helpful in gauging the early needs. From there, I just started navigating it a day at a time as things arose. So one of the things that happened very early on was they were disenrolled from daycares. So I didn't know, I don't have other kids, and so I couldn't compare how their behaviors at 2 and 3 compared to other 2 and 3-year-olds necessarily. But when
Mm,
they started getting disenrolled from daycare, it's like, well, okay, this is a pretty good indicator that we're talking some higher needs than your average 2 or 3-year-old. So yeah, it became pretty clear. The other thing was the 3-year-old had an IEP, special education, individualized education plan when he came to me, and he was already doing some specialized preschool. So that was great that he already had those services set up, and that actually to me was an indicator to get my other son evaluated when he turned 3 to be able to access some of those services as well, and he did qualify, and so then that opened some doors for a few services early on.
yeah. So we don't talk about this much, but I was a foster parent in the state of Iowa before you. So I stopped fostering when I was running for a political office. So I would have stopped fostering around 2005, 2006. So but I had taken higher needs girls on purpose. The goal at the time was to try to transition them from institutions to I was a therapeutic foster home with the goal of putting them into lower level homes. And let me just say, for the amount of support I was promised and what happened after that, yeah.
Yeah.
That if you're with your situation and very similar, that's the amount of support's just not there. And in my case, they knew they were high needs. So there was no reason at all to not know the level of support that was going to be required. And it just was very, very, very frustrating. So I can't even imagine. I didn't start that young. My youngest one was like 12, which in girls, that's a lot of fun. You just hit right at the middle of good times. And so we started from 12 to kind of 16, and what a mess. So
So
well,
let's talk about that for a minute because I too share some foster care experience in that my wife licensed foster homes for the first half of her career, and we did some live-in foster parenting where we went off site and lived in a home that took kids in that was in existence at that time as an alternative, right? Of more of a treatment level foster care space to provide respite to foster parents. And this is really challenging work, right? And I can be honest with you that we wanted to foster, but we saw all the safety issues and we were afraid for our own kids' safety at the
yeah.
time. And unfortunately, we saw some things that most people don't see. We worked with really difficult kids at the time, but challenging, right? We're both professionals in the field. And so, why, when we know the data that 80% of kids that enter the foster care system, no matter what age they are more likely to have mental health conditions, experience childhood trauma, all the ACEs. I mean, we could talk about all the data. Why is our system not providing more supports and wraparound? Because we know that that's what's going on. What's wrong with our system? Because we're going back 20 years here as we're having this conversation, right? What's happened, and is it getting better or is it actually getting worse from what you've experienced, Nina?
I don't know for sure if it's getting worse, but I will tell you there's still not enough for kids that have complex needs. So one of the pieces that I think is missing is there's not a lot available between outpatient weekly services for kids and the intensive residential option, that's the PMIC programs in the state of Iowa. There's just not anything in between there that's available. So for example, my kids could do weekly therapy, but there were no more intensive day programs or partial hospitalization programs exist, but they exist as step down programs from full hospitalization. And the hospital programs tend to be for the very acute issues, if someone is at risk of harming themselves or someone else. And they don't really provide any sort of programming for kids that have complex behavior issues that aren't in that acute range. So I think that's what's really missing for kids that have trauma histories. For kids like mine, what they do is they test their environment a lot. And I'm guessing that's what you saw with the kids you're working with
Mhm.
too,
Absolutely.
because they don't feel this perceived sense of safety because of their early history and their mental health issues. And so they're always testing because they don't feel safe. Can these adults keep me safe? How will they handle my behaviors? Can they handle my behaviors? And so I think that's what we need is to build out that continuum of care so that there are trained professionals that can work with these kids in the moment. So when my kid is testing and he's doing some behavior that's hard to manage, is there somebody there that understands trauma, that has the trauma-informed techniques that can apply them in the moment and say, okay, I see you right now. We're going to work through this and it's all going to be okay. Because what ends up happening is, okay, that behavior is unacceptable. And then
Yep.
some kind of consequence or punishment given,
Yep.
which unfortunately doesn't help kids build skills. And at the end of the day, I think that all kids do as well as they can. But if they don't have the skills, then they're relying on adults and it's pretty maladaptive. So
Right.
it's coming out as these bad behaviors.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've noticed is you have to have a specific, like you said, they have to have training and understand trauma, because people will mean well and sometimes come in with either a tough love approach, which doesn't work, or overly, oh, poor baby approach and doesn't work. And so what I found when I would find folks that were supposed to be helpful to me, I'd end up being blamed for not being able to handle their behavior, or that it was my fault that they were acting out, or my fault that was making it worse. And so instead of coming in as a partner to help stabilize and keep the parent, it was almost like, you have to remove and there's nowhere for them to go.
Yeah.
And so, the goal is not to keep them with parents and have skilled people to help keep you in that home. Then we end up moving. So, it would be the respite, which that was almost impossible to find in my period of time. It was almost impossible. And so, when you're at your wit's end, and we were trained, and I'm a therapist above that, so trained, still couldn't figure it out, right? They just had greater needs than what we could do. And it's not their fault, to your point. And the little guys I had, they weren't that little, but the ladies that I had came from such trauma and so many placements, and so many things had happened to them, and deaths of family members and things that happened prior to them even coming to me, that, it just is a mess. And so, there's a lot there. So you're right. I think that gap still exists. And so well, send them somewhere mentality, or they can maybe touch base once a week or every other week or something. And that's just not enough for some folks that really need help. And there's a lot more of these kids. So Jason, I know we were going to talk about some data now about how many kids are we talking about, because I think the needs are growing. I don't think that there's fewer children needing help. And so this gap is going to get wider and wider because there's more now needing assistance that we just aren't making it happen.
Yeah, and we'll throw some different links in the show notes. But one of the things that jumped out at me is the number of Iowa youth receiving behavioral health services rose by 40% between 2018 and 2023. So we know that there's a great need amongst youth. And I think this is kind of where we think about a policy issue, right? I love it when Nina starts talking about continuums of care, because you know how excited I get when we talk about continuums, Renee. But I think about this is just again highlights the difference between we keep fitting kids into an adult continuum of care. We haven't adequately built out a children's mental health system in the state of Iowa. I've been talking about that since I came back to Iowa, and I'm not going to say how many years ago that was, but it's over 20 years, right? That there hasn't been a truly aligned continuum of care for kids that looks different than adults, because we just talked about all the reasons the needs are different. How the crisis system to respond to foster parents is very different than the crisis system we need for adults. The training of the people who respond to that is different. Those respite facilities look different. The training for foster parents is different. That's all part of our mental health continuum, and it continues to be separated and segmented out. So I'm not talking about data. I'm talking about systems, Renee. And I think that this conversation really helps us to better understand the real life dilemma when we put off doing those things. When we say we don't have the money to invest in our kids, then where do we end up? We end up having the same problems and causing all of this trauma to continue over and over again. And so it's unfortunate, and good people who are trying to do good things. I think of all the foster parents I've known and all the heartbreak that comes along with putting all that blood, sweat, and tears into trying to support a youth and a kid, and helping them to be better off. How challenging that is when you don't have the support that you need.
Yep, I agree. And so the system then that we land into, which is part of the conversation today, is you crash right into juvenile justice or the justice system as they age.
Yeah.
And so I know with the kids that I had, that's exactly what happened. I had, when they got to 16, 17, 18, in some cases were then arrested as adults because they crossed over. And I know that's part of your story too, Nina. So how young was the first time that your young ones got kind of crashed into that system of juvenile justice, and how has that played a role in all of this?
Yeah, so the crashing into the juvenile justice system is something I've been trying to avoid for a long time. So I've advocated very intensely for them in community programs in school to try to keep them away from legal involvement. So my kids have a well-documented history of incidences that have happened over the years related to their behaviors and a lot of school suspensions and, getting sent home from programs, getting kicked out of programs. So we have all that history, but luckily it never resulted in charges until recently. So my 16-year-old son struggled to get him into a more intensive type of a program. He has a slate of behaviors, but one of them that's particularly challenging is he was starting fires. And I just could not keep him safe no matter what I did. I couldn't keep myself safe, couldn't keep the house safe because he's he's just very fascinated by fire. I don't think he means any real harm, has no intent of harming people with the fire, but he has complex needs. He has an intellectual disability, he has the mental health challenges and the trauma history, and he's intrigued with fire, he's impulsive, and he just plays around with it without realizing how fast it can go to a dangerous situation. So I applied this was May of 2024, to a couple of different programs that were PMICs in the state that might have a program that would work for him. I was recognizing at that point, not all of them are going to be a fit, but there were a few that might be. Applied to those and then applied to a few out-of-state places. And the summer went by. I heard back from a few that said, no, we're not going to admit him. And I was still waiting to hear from a couple of others. And then in August of 2024, we hit a crisis point where it was the third time he'd started a fire in the house, and I just couldn't risk it anymore. And so I knew that he needed to be in an out-of-home placement because I couldn't keep him safe. So at that point, I reached out to the insurance company, I reached out to DHHS, and I told all those parties involved, I can't care for him at home, I need help. And so the insurance company at that point, they said, okay, we'd like you to apply to every PMIC program in Iowa and all the other ones that we know of that are out of state. So in total, that was 21 different programs.
Wow.
Yep. And the bad news is every single place denied admission. So I'm talking with this team, and the insurance company, they actually did a great job with case coordination, and they brought all the players together so we could talk. And DHHS had somebody from their Medicaid team on there, and we're talking about options. And basically they said, well, the option that you have at this point is that he can go to an adult group home. They'll make exceptions for 16-year-olds. He can go to the adult group home and he can stay in your custody. And I was asking about other facilities that are in the category of QRTP, the residential treatment programs. And they were saying, no, 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 you can't do those because the kid has to be in state custody in order to be in that type of program. And it's a group home. It's not what I was hoping for him. It's not a therapeutic residential treatment program, but it does have a therapy element to it. And I had heard from some other families about certain facilities that had been good for their kids. So I was asking questions, but they said, no, no, they have to be in state custody. That's not an option for you. Well, that was at the point where I realized, okay, I think I need to really consider the state custody option called the China in Iowa for listeners that don't know. So the China process is when the courts are involved, the parent gives up custody, then the kid goes into state custody, and then they qualify for this type of program. And so I went that route. It's not an easy route to go. They don't make it easy for anybody. So you have to actually have an investigation done. You have to be deemed unfit to parent your child, and then they will initiate this court process. But it is the only way to access it. This was even me talking with DHHS saying, hey, I feel like I have no other options. My kid needs treatment. No place will take him. I need to initiate this process. And then saying, and you can't voluntarily initiate that process. So it's a very problematic space when a kid like mine desperately needs treatment and there's just no treatment options that are voluntarily available to the family. So, to get to your question, Renee, of how do we collide with the juvenile justice system, he got into one of these programs through this very complex process of me giving up custody of him. And within a few weeks, he made some bad choices. He accrued charges for those behaviors. And then he became involved with the juvenile justice system. He was arrested, he was placed in juvenile detention, and the problem is, and this is what has happened since then, so that happened in November, and since then he has cycled in and out. So he has gone to a group home, then he has accrued more charges for behaviors. And here's the frustrating part. These are behaviors that most of them are things that he has been doing for a very long time that we haven't been able to get help for. It's just now that he has charges, he gets more charges for those same behaviors that I've been asking for help for so long. And then he gets more charges, and then he gets kicked out of the group home that he's in. And just because of the nature of the system, they don't keep spaces available for kids. So then he goes back to juvenile detention. And then when he finally gets out of juvenile detention, and it is what you were talking about, Renee, where do these kids go? That's the question a lot for my son in the last 9 months is, well, where do we put him? Like, he didn't do well in this placement. He's got this risk for this. We don't know where he should go. And so even in this, like, I would say the best of the worst options, there still isn't a place that's right for him. And so he's sort of getting a little bit of treatment sometimes, but it's nothing like what I would hope for him. And unfortunately, he keeps accruing more charges as time goes on.
Yep. And so my job now with the parole board, right, is I see these people, this profile, unfortunately, pretty often, right? Because then the charges, when they turn 18, if there isn't a period of time in which there are no charges, those don't get sealed. And when the juvenile records don't get sealed, then they roll right into adults. And we have, depending upon the type of charges, there are youth offenders that are in our adult prisons. And then when they go past that, then they become in the general population once they turn 18. But that profile of, of not understanding. So there's intellectual disabilities, there's challenges on top of that, then they do charges of behaviors that people think are inappropriate. So there's charges that just starts coming, and then they don't do well in this system either. So then they come into prison of the system and they don't do well because they don't, well, they might do okay in the absolute and structured environment sometimes. But when we then try to release them, then you're back to the same thing, right? Then they don't understand, they don't follow the directions, and they don't have a place to live because maybe some of the charges have precluded them from places. So fire setting is a big charge that we don't have housing for if I'm releasing anybody, because they won't take an arson charge in most housing. And so that's one example. So it's just really frustrating because there's a group of people who need help, and our system is not designed to help. And there's a big hole between HHS and corrections. And so I think it's horrible, Nina, that you've had to give up custody just to try to get services for the kids that you've tried to care about for all these years. And that's the only best option that there is. That doesn't make sense. So it doesn't feel like we've come a long way in this system as far as, quote, improving it at this point. It doesn't feel better. So I know, Nina, you were part of a big lawsuit about this and about your kids. So I also know that their settlement has been made and now there's supposed to be a new plan. So what do you know about that? What do you know about the new plan? Is this going to get better? What do you expect to see in the future? Talk to us about that, because I know you've been right in the heart of all that conversation.
Sure, yeah. So one of my sons was a plaintiff on that case, and he was one of three that represents thousands in the state, and very proud to have been able to be a part of it. The plan won't be implemented in time to help my kids because the full rollout of the plan won't happen until 2032. But I am glad that our story can help create the needed change in the state. So as his support person with him as a plaintiff on the case, I was able to engage in the process of determining what some of those needed changes should be in the state. So they
Mhm.
would craft a plan. They've had similar lawsuits in several states, which I think is great as a foundation of how to build out these systems and how to ensure that the system is properly implemented based off of their findings and experiences in other states. So they crafted a plan, then they ran it past me and the other support people for the other plaintiffs and got our feedback. And then they also had a public comment period where others could weigh in on it as well. So one of the things that makes me hopeful about the settlement and some of the services that they're planning to expand is around case coordination. I think case coordination, if it's done well, it's just a lifesaver for families because it takes the guesswork out of what's available within the system. There's not always as many resources as families need, but having somebody that's a professional that does case coordination, especially I think when it's through the insurance company, I think they have potentially the best vantage point for doing an assessment of what's available in the community and getting families connected with that without a family having to make individual phone calls to individual providers, trying to figure out what there is. Does my kid qualify? How do I apply? How do I get the service? So that's one piece that was missing in the state, and that was part of what the lawsuit was based on, but it's also part of what they need to build out in the future is providing that robust case coordination for families.
That's good. That's really been a challenge. So Jason, do you have any thoughts on all of that? Because I know you've been around a minute for case coordination and you have thoughts when it comes to that
I
topic.
do.
So
I
what are your
wasn't
thoughts,
going to
Jason?
say it. I didn't want to be the
You
negative
should just say
Nelly.
it.
It's frustrating because, over the years, I've seen meetings where we bring everyone together and there's 6 different people who are supposed to have the label of navigator, care coordinator, social worker, you name it. And no one has a full perspective of what's happening. And so I am somewhat cynical to the system that has been fragmented for so long, and for a while we were promised integrated health homes that was going to provide coordination as part of the MCOs to specifically around children. There's actually a children's, and that never worked out quite right. And so I hope that the state has learned from those past failures, let's call it what it is, that we can find a way to connect the HHS care coordinators with those integrated health homes. And now we have healthcare navigators. We have all these components, but no one who's actually empowered to be that single point that you really need at this time to go out and help you to find all of those places. The fact that you were made responsible to apply to 21 places across the country is completely unacceptable in our healthcare system. If I had a cancer diagnosis or, my mom fell and broke her hip a few weeks ago, I didn't have to go find a surgeon. I didn't have to go apply to different hospitals to get her there, right? And so why is this part of our healthcare system so fragmented that we don't have people there to do that? It would be unacceptable in the other part of the healthcare system to put that back on the family. So those are my thoughts, Renee. You see, you shouldn't ask me my thoughts when it comes to that.
Well, they leak out, so I needed to ask. So what do you think, Nina? Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, so one thing that I would share, and I agree with Jason in that this doesn't work like other parts of the healthcare system because basically what's happening is in this mental health space, they're saying to me, if as if it was the analogy of broken hip. No, this is too bad of a break. So we
Right.
actually can't help you because
Yeah.
it's just too bad of a break.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening for our kids with complex needs is they're saying, sorry, we are not going to admit them into any of these programs because my sense is that the demand is high and they can take kids with less complex needs that meet their criteria and they're going to have better outcomes because those kids are less complex cases. So I get it, and yet I don't know what that means for kids like mine who do have complex needs and desperately need the services. What I see happening is that we're just involved with these justice systems and it's not really solving anything. It's costing a lot of money. It's wasting a lot of time. There are a lot of professionals engaged with it that really lack insight on trauma and disability and mental illness. And so you get professionals saying, well, he just needs to behave himself. And it's like, well, guys, that's the whole deal right there, is that he can't behave himself. He doesn't have the
Right.
skills yet. He can't deal with the impulses. He can't deal with the peer pressure. We have to help him build the skills because that's what's going to set him up for a chance at life, where you just telling him and lecturing him saying, well, he needs to behave himself, completely unproductive.
Yep.
I agree. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. So I'm going to roll into our self-care policy of the week. So the Recovering Politician Self-Care Policy of the Week, it is an acronym called KISS. You keep things, you improve things, you start things, and you stop things. And once a season, kind of every quarter, I figure out that I'm just doing too much stuff. Just too much stuff. So I have to actually kind of think through the things that are on my calendar, the things that are in my box to do, and just be like, what things do I have to actually keep? And then what things can I do better at that are like a system that's just not working? And like all of this work that we do here, right, is always improving. I mean, you never want to kick out the behavioral health system, but gosh, it needs a lot of work. So, right, those things make a difference. But then there's things in my life that I need to start doing. Maybe I need to drink more water, or I need to take more walks or take more breaks, whatever. But then there's always a list of stops. And right now I'm really focusing on the stops. It's like, what am I doing that is just wasting some time that I could be doing better with something else? And that doesn't mean I'm not one of those really crazy organized people that like, oh, I could use that 5 minutes to listen to a book or listen to a podcast. Not like that. But it's stuff that just is like the draining things that are just like, that's an irritation. Do I need to do it? So currently on my list of things to stop is being president of the HOA. I
Oh,
accidentally
really?
landed here,
Yeah.
really dislike it. And so coming up, I'm gonna be the meeting's coming up and somebody else wants to do it. Do I think that's gonna go well? No. But do I care? No.
Right.
So that's going to be stopped. And that's a lot of just a lot of headache right there. I didn't mean to get involved in this. I filled in for a friend and now I'm going to be done. So think about all the things out there that you could stop doing, because there's probably things on the list that you're like, oh, that's annoying. We should stop that. You can't stop everything that's annoying, but there's some things you can. So I over committed. So I'm going to get out. All right. So today we talked all about Nina's journey with her kids, and she's done such an amazing job. And I just want to thank you, Nina, for being an advocate, and for a really good advocate, and being one that fights for your kids, and for fighting the system, because it helps to put a face, unfortunately, with a system problem like this. People can say, I know her, I know those kids, and we need to do better. And so thank you for that settlement and that lawsuit, even though that's never a fun way to go. But having to push forward and making a change, and you make a big change in working with TAC. You didn't really get to talk about that much, but what you're continuing to do at the national level is really impressive. So thank you for all of that. Is there anything you'd like to say before we go today? I'll give the floor to Nina first. Is there anything you'd like to say before we go for today?
I'd just like to say thank you for having this platform to talk about real issues in the state and from your vantage point elsewhere in the country as well. I think the more we can talk about it, the more we can share stories, and the more we can pinpoint what the issues are, that's our real chance at change.
Agreed. Thank you so much. Jason, did you have anything to follow up before we go?
No, thank you for being here and sharing, Nina. I think it's fantastic because I know there's so many other people in your shoes and you're so articulate in being able to share. And I know that takes a great amount of strength. So your advocacy is amazing, not just across the state, but across the country. So thank you very much for what you do.
Yeah, thank you, Nina. So thanks everybody for listening today. And don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, or YouTube. And if you want to join us on a podcast to talk about your story, we'd love to have you. Jason's got stickers for those too. But if you're going to give us a review and tell us how we're doing, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. See you next time.